Hello and welcome to episode 182 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is February 3rd, 2020. I am Rollo McFlugel, and with me is Slappy Jones 2. Show notes page for this episode will be mcflugel.com/182, where you'll be able to find some links to the things we talk about, how to check out our guest, and also to check out libertymugs.com, where we recently just added pint glasses. So we only have 3 up there now, but if you've got any ones that, you want to turn in from a mug to a pint glass, let us know. We'll get that done right away for you. That's how we'll prioritize adding the pint glasses. And also, I forgot to say this last week, but we have a Telegram group now. So if you want to chat with us and make fun of everyone who's not in the Telegram group, go to the show notes page, click the link, and that will get you access. So, Slappy, you going to introduce our guest?
Yeah, sure. So, today we're going to be talking about kidnapping children and other ways Rollo would like to violate the non-aggression principle. And to do that, we're bringing on our friend Jake from Tasting Anarchy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, I think this is your 3rd episode.
Probably something along those lines.
Yeah, I think it's 3.
Better than probably the best three-peat we've had, by far.
All right.
Oh, definitely.
I like the idea of these Liberty mug pint glasses, and maybe for Childeberg Dose we'll do some sort of like a prize for something. I'm not sure what yet. I'm trying to think of like different ways to do like prizes and stuff at Childeberg Dose.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I have to think
and do like gifts that are relevant to us.
Right. Yeah, I'll have to. We'll kind of table this for the side, but there's a different. Do you use Printful for your Childeberg store?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
There's another thing called Guten, where they used to do
Okay.
beer. I used to use them for beer mugs, but they didn't have it automated for like WordPress or WooCommerce. But I checked back again, and they now have it just like automated, like Printful does. So.
Oh, cool. Okay.
That's why I added it. And they didn't have pint glasses there before. And they've got a bunch of other stuff that Printful doesn't have. But that is neither here nor there. We're really nuts and bolts and things, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I do actually want to kidnap kids. Just like a few weeks ago, Slappy and I were talking about kidnapping prisoners.
We were.
But yeah, Jake, do you want to kind of introduce this idea? Because we've kind of talked about it before. I don't know if we're on Twitter or somewhere else. Kind of
One of those chats, right?
Yeah. I mean, you and I, and actually Slappy, you too, but not as frequently, have sort of one of many side chats. I'm sure that most libertarians have, and different things come up at different points. And one of the things that you and I have talked about a couple times on there is in relation to children, like strategic nap violations. That's what I like to call it. Is like looking at a situation, understanding that this could potentially be a nap violation, but the consequences of violating the nap is less than the potential consequences of not violating it.
right.
If that makes sense.
Like if you have a tractor and I don't have a tractor, I can take your tractor. But
right.
I actually I'll have to remember to put this in the show notes page. But I wrote an article maybe a couple of years ago about arguing that the non-aggression principle is not axiomatic. So there are some situations where I do think it would be permissible to violate it. And I do think that this is one of those situations, because that is the first reaction.
Wait, when you want to kidnap a kid? We didn't even like lay any context to that.
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying that like because Jacob just said that it would be a violation of the nap, but permissible. And I just want to say that like there's
right.
I think there are situations, and so this article will kind of be like the backstop for me saying that like I don't think it's something that you can never violate.
Well, and see, I take a slightly different approach to it than that. Is I do think that the nap is, I guess, axiomatic. Is that you're either violating it or you're not violating it.
Sure.
But I guess that like the position that like I would take would be as far as like strategic violations would be violating it in the hopes that whatever you do is recognized in a normative sense to have been okay. So like one that might be me having a hiss. Sorry.
That's all right.
Actually, it is me because my wife is releasing the pressure on the Instant Pot.
Oh, okay, that's fine. That's fine. I thought it was something.
But anyway, but kind of going back to that is, so like for like one of the examples, I think Walter Block uses this example is that if you saw somebody, they're texting on their cell phone or whatever, and they're not paying attention, they're about to walk into traffic, and you grab them by the arm and pull them out of traffic, right? Well, that technically is a NAP violation. You're violating their person, their property. You're using force to make them alter their course, which is not your right to do, supposedly, theoretically. But what you're doing is you're doing it with the expectation that they're going to be like, oh, thank God I didn't walk into traffic, right?
Right. So
they would forgive you and retroactively or whatever, just be like, yeah, I've decided that I would have, as a person who owns my body, I would rather people pull me out of traffic than not pull me out of traffic, right?
Sure.
So
very similar.
Kind of,
similar, like implied contract, where, or if someone's has a heart attack and they're passed out on the side of the road, you can start giving them chest compressions and giving them CPR under the
right.
It's a very good assumption to make that they'll, if they come to, they'll say, oh yeah, thank you for touching my body.
Right, exactly. They wanted that. And the thing is like you may have like people in society who are like complete assholes or whatever, and that's what they do is they just walk into traffic and hoping that somebody will pull them out and then they can sue them because that's what they get their jollies from that or whatever. But then you would have a secondary layer which would be, so it doesn't matter what's a NAP and what's not a NAP violation if societally nobody recognized that. So like one of the things that I've always kind of thought about this, and this will kind of get us into like the child thing, is you always hear these stories that like the ancient Greeks were always raping little boys, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, why didn't their society collapse? Why didn't all those kids have like terrible PTSD and all that sort of stuff? And I think that part of that is because there is a secondary structure, which is the normative structure. Things that are traumatic to us are not necessarily traumatic to other people if the larger picture sees it as normal. So sure. a lot of like, and they've actually done some psychological studies on this on kids and stuff like that, is that kids who, if something bad happens and they're beaten or whatever, that does create changes in the brain, but more changes are created in the brain after the fact. If everybody's always going like, oh, you poor child, you're a victim and all that sort of stuff, that actually creates further changes in the brain, and they're not able to recover from a lot of that trauma. So trauma processing is sometimes a societal thing. And so if you're a little kid and you're being raped all the time, but all of the kids are being raped all the time, just like in, suppose, I don't know how true this is or not. This is what everybody always talks about with the Greeks, but with the ancient Greeks is that they were doing this kind of stuff all the time. But also like some of the city states were like, no, that city state's like fucked up that they're doing that. And, but those, they like their society wasn't collapsing as a result of this. So it's that when people have a similar trauma and move through it, they may recreate that trauma again, but it's not as disruptive to them when they have people around them that have gone through the same thing. This is, I think, one of the reasons why soldiers who have PTSD seek out other soldiers that have PTSD. Is they kind of understand it.
Oh,
I think process.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we tend to do that. I mean, shared experiences kind of create friendships and camaraderie and everything. And even too, like to a much lighter example of, we've all experienced it where you're growing up and the way your parents do things in the house, or the way you do things or think of things, that when you're older and you're with other people and whatever that was gets brought up and you're like, wait a second, not everyone like does this weird thing that I do.
Yeah.
And so you realize that like, oh, I feel like shame now because people kind of laughed at me, whereas before it was just like, oh yeah, it's just the normal thing. I'd love to think of an example.
Well, a very good example for this, and this will kind of get into the child topic again, is in America, most young men up until recently were circumcised, which is not medically necessary. Like I was circumcised. I'm not worried or whatever about saying that or whatever. Right. But it's not medically necessary. It's not more hygienic, despite what people say. I would argue that it's less hygienic because you're talking about having a cut on some little kid's penis that is then in a diaper full of feces and piss. every time. Like, that is not hygienic. I don't know where this idea comes. Like, anyways, that aside, like, this is something that American culture has done for a really long time. And my wife, who's from outside of the United States, when she was confronted that this is what happens in the United States, was like, wow, really? Like, nope, that doesn't happen to anybody except for Jews where I'm from. And
I didn't even realize that was I thought it was a Jewish and a Christian thing, not even that it was an American thing.
It's an American thing, and it was done. This may be apocryphal. I don't know if this is true. From my understanding, that it got started because they thought it would help kids not masturbate. And then they came up with all these other justifications, like it's more hygienic and all that kind of thing. But like the what I've heard is that's what it's from, is that it was like back when like Kellogg was trying to get everybody to eat like oatmeal and things like that. Like, it was around that same time they were like, well, masturbation's really bad for you, so to get your kids not to masturbate, we're going to like cut off their foreskin, because for some reason that's going to do. I don't really understand the reasoning for it, but it's also a big business too. Like, that's all sold. Like, foreskins are sold to other industries and used for skin grafts and cosmetics and all these different things. So they're like, it's a big business too. So there's an incentive to keep that going. But like, I asked my parents about it, and because I wish I hadn't been circumcised. That's not a choice that I made. And I said, this is an uncomfortable topic, but what was your guys' reasoning? I wasn't mad at them, because I know that most people have had this. And I was like, what was your reasoning? And my mom said, well, I left that up to your dad, because I'm not a boy. I don't know. And my dad said the reason he did it was because there was one kid in his school that wasn't circumcised. And when back then, and I didn't have to do this in high school, but in his high school, they all had to change and shower together after gym class. And he said he was clearly different than all the rest of the boys, and they all made fun of him. And then the girls in the school found out about it, and they all made fun of him. And he said, I didn't want that to happen to my son. And because he had been circumcised, he didn't know any different.
Right.
So I think that's kind of one of those things where, like, I'm not angry with this is like a weird like getting into topics and stuff that are in the chat that we're not necessarily bringing into this, but like things like when people are like, don't hit your kids when they're referring to spankings. So like there's a difference between like beating your kid up and spanking your kid.
Right.
I believe in peaceful parenting. I don't think you should spank your kids, but I think that it's a false equivalency to say that they're the same thing. I think that parents do their best with the knowledge that they have, and this does go back to that, is that like, probably there's a lot of Greeks who are like, what, I was raped as a kid, I probably should be raping other kids like that. It was good for me, or whatever. They had their justifications. So that's kind of like one of those things where it's like, yeah, these are clearly NAP violations, but to get back to the original point, which is your society has normative processes that it establishes, and we as libertarians may have different thought processes on this and establish an axiomatic principle, or even if the NAP is just a guideline or whatever, we go like, these are things that we need to rethink. But at the same time, if you have a anarchist system and a court system set up to make judgments, if the entire society or 90% of the society or whatever thinks that it's okay to beat up your kids, you're not getting a judgment against you. It's not actionable. And that's where the normative case comes in.
Right. And just to follow up on that a little bit, my parents, spanked me a little bit as a kid. And the difference between beating and spanking is, my parents spanked me a little bit. And if anyone were to give them any trouble over doing that, then I will beat that person. Because like, they were not, it wasn't abusive. Will I do it with my kids? No. But like you said, they were doing the best they could with the best information they had. It was, did my parents make mistakes? Yes. I'm also going to make mistakes if I have kids. It's the nature of it. So,
yeah, well, that's part of homesteading parenthood. So,
right.
And that kind of goes to what we're talking about, is you're taking an action in hopes that in the future, that person, if you do violate the NAP with them, that they'll forgive you for it. And it'll be kind of like the slate will be washed clean. And that gets into the kidnapping of kids, which we've talked about this in the chat, is that CPS does I would say a poor job when it comes to taking care of kids in the United States. There's a lot of very bad horror stories. Now, on the other hand, they do take kids who sometimes need to be taken away. So in a anarchist society where we respect the nap and there is a normative case going on, how do you seize kids from parents that are clearly abusive, that are beating them up or raping them or whatever the deal is? And the way that I proposed it in the chat was what I called was a strategic nap violation, which is you start up an organization called like the Friends of Children or whatever, and you kidnap the kid. And in the hopes and the acceptance that this may not be the case and that you may end up having a tort against you and you may end up having to pay damages to a really terrible person, that you're hoping that the court and society as a whole will look at the situation and go, yeah, you know what, you're right. You found good evidence that this kid was in a situation where they were getting beat up or raped or malnourished or whatever the case is. And you did take the responsibility onto yourself, and you're in a situation where you may have a tort against you, but the court is going to dismiss it because this kid shouldn't be in the custody of this person. And right now we're in a different situation. And the situation is that CPS operates in most states without any oversight. They don't answer to a legislature or anything like that. They answer to themselves. And the system is set up in such a way that it is economically advantageous for them to seize children and place them into foster care, not necessarily to try to get them adopted, but to put them into a situation where they're going to possibly be abused additionally. It's also economically incentivizes them to put the children on medication that they don't need and to put them into different types of like psychological care that they don't necessarily need. And because every single one of those levels adds an additional payment. So there was a really good episode of Mance Rayder's show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, or Pete Raymond, I guess he goes by now, and where he had on some people from Texas, to say that I'm from, and they talk about their experience in CPS, where they said this is stuff they didn't realize when they first went into adopting kids, but they had 4 biological kids of their own. They wanted more kids, but the wife in the situation wasn't able to have more kids for whatever reason. And so they went, you know what, we'll go ahead and adopt. And they got into this and they discovered how corrupt and perverse the CPS system is. And they were getting kids that when they took the kids and adopted them and then took them to a physician that was outside of the CPS system, the doctor was saying stuff like, this kid can't be on this number of medications, it will kill him. And but they were just loading them up on stuff, because in the foster care system, if you have a child, for every medication they're on, you get more money. So not only is the medication paid for by the state, but then you as a foster parent also get additional money.
Yeah, I remember that episode. That was absolutely wild.
Yeah,
it's one of those things where I mean, we're libertarians. We think the government does a bad job with stuff. We kind of know that the CPS does a bad job with stuff, and then you hear that, and you're just like, this is way worse.
Yeah,
this is way.
But you know
worse.
what? Sort of on the flip side, because I do want to be balanced on this, is that there's other CPS stories. There's actually a subreddit about CPS stories where most of them are positive,
mm-hmm.
and you have situations like where CPS sees a child because the mother was sending the child across the border on like a bus to go spend the weekend with a couple of guys. She's like 5 or 6 years old, and then they send her back with money, and basically it's prostitution of a child. And CPS steps in and figures out and takes the kid. But then on the flip side of that, you also see like one of in the Pete Raymond episode where he talks about this is one of the groups of 3 kids that family adopted. They said when they actually reviewed the case and looked in, the only reason those kids were seized was because the family that they were seized from was poor and couldn't fight it. Yeah. And there's a lot of cases like that. There's a really good one, good one meaning terrible one, in California where Eastern European immigrants, they had their baby seized because they wanted a second opinion on surgery for a heart murmur. And the second opinion said, your child doesn't need surgery, he'll outgrow it. But the primary opinion was like stacking up all of these medical bills and stuff like that. And they are the ones who called CPS. And CPS came in without a warrant, because CPS doesn't need a warrant, seized the child. This is immigrants who, they spoke English fine in the interviews and stuff. You can actually go see it in on, I think Reason. It was Reason that did a video interview with them and stuff like that. The child's name is Sammy Nikolai, I think, and he had he's a baby. He's a baby, and they took him because the parents were like, we want to make sure that he needs surgery before we give him surgery.
Right. Yeah.
It's a crazy thing. And there was another case, I think, in that same video where the mom had, and she actually won a $5 million lawsuit against CPS because it had been found by the jury that she was directly targeted by CPS for not complying with them. And she had her 2 daughters taken from her for 6 years. And ended up winning and winning custody back. But yeah, I mean, so CPS is not accountable. And that's why I'm saying that the alternative in a anarchist society is that the Friends of Children, the organization that we run or whatever together, accepts the fact that you may be held liable if you make a mistake. So you better damn well be sure that you're taking those kids away from a bad situation and that the court will rule in your favor before you take them. Whereas in the status system, the CPS is rewarded for taking these kids.
Right. And also, to bring up a point that you said a little bit earlier, it has to have a better outcome. So if our Friends with Children organization ends up putting these kids in foster care or adoptive parents or doing something, you have to do something with them. And every time we do it, it ends up being a bad situation. That the next time we go to collect a kid and kidnap a kid, people are going to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. I mean,
yeah,
we don't, maybe this is not a great situation, but you are not the people to take care of it. So
exactly.
There's a much stronger and better incentive structure because you're just relying on the goodness of someone's heart when it's the government. Because, and it is a good point to make that, sometimes the government does do a fine job of things. There are bad situations now where kids should not be with their parents. And it's kind of like not the same exact thing, but the government builds roads, and we use the roads, and roads are fine and good. So, but that's not a good enough argument to say therefore the government should manage the roads, because we can point at all the problems that they have with it. This is the same thing, except we're dealing with the livelihood of children and not asphalt. So
yeah. Well, and I think actually, and it's not a very compelling argument, I think, in most cases, because people instinctively, they're like, oh, these are kids, like we need to protect them and that sort of stuff. But like Walter Block actually makes a very, very extreme argument, as he's prone to do, because that's his wheelhouse, is defending the undefendable and all that. He has a really interesting example that kind of made me start thinking about this originally, is like, what should you do in that? And the example he says, like, imagine this is a horrible example, and it's not a nice thing to think about, but this is something that could happen. Is you've got a child and a single mother, let's say, and they're both a day away from starving to death, right? And nobody's going to help them for whatever reason. Is that like they're in an isolated situation where for some reason they can't get food at all, and some rich person comes along and he says, hey, I'm going to feed you both, and you're going to live, but I want one night with your child, right? So now you're faced with, it's a Sophie's choice type argument where you're going like, well, what's worse? Is the kid starving to death or being raped by some like sicko, right? So, and that's kind of the situation with CPS that we're in, is that, yeah, you know what, the kid may not be in an ideal situation, but the alternative, which is a lot of, not all foster care, because there's a lot of really great foster parents out there, but the alternative is that they may go into foster care, and like the child rape statistics and the abuse statistics in foster care are astronomical. Particularly with group homes, not necessarily foster care, but like group homes are really, really bad in a lot of places. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, you're kind of going like, well, what's the alternative? And like you were saying, in a free market situation, if CPS is the one taking them away every time, and then they have a very high rate of placing them into places that are really bad, that nobody's going to rule in favor of them anymore, and they're going to be held liable.
Right. And to the point about that Walter Block example, and you're right, it is very terrible to think about and not good. But if we can agree, and I think most people would agree, that you should give the kid to the guy in that situation. So we can say that there is a situation where that is, using it's an extreme example and it's set up very specifically so that there's really no other way out of it. But if we agree that that would be justified to do in that case, then it exists somewhere. There exists in this. I can't think of the word, but there's a sliding scale kind of, and there's an area where it would be permissible to do something that would otherwise be very bad for someone. In order to have a better outcome. It depends on a lot of variables and everything, but it exists somewhere. There's a line somewhere. We don't know where it exists, but that's why you have to take and judge things individually. So you can look at all these variables and make the best decision you can. And the other situation too is that we don't have the benefit of perfect foresight and knowledge of what's going to happen in the future. We're given a small amount of information and we try to, make the best of it. And so it's unfortunately, it's not going to be perfect every time. That's why we have businesses that fail and do other things. But, you can't just assume. The alternative is assuming that one party, the government, does have this perfect foresight and knowledge. And that's why they're not allowed to have any competition against them. Because why would you have competition against something that's perfect?
Yeah. Well, and can you imagine, like, in the government structure situation, like Texas CPA, or not CPA, CPS, Texas CPS going to California and like seizing children in California, like in that type of situation, it would set it up so that now you have Texas CPS and California CPS competing with each other to make sure that the public perception, at least, is that one or the other is doing a better job. And I think in an anarchist society, you would probably have a similar situation, which is you'd have competing friends of kids and friends of babies and friends of, the handicap or whatever it was, who would be going in and doing these things where they would risk liability in an effort to make sure that these people who can't care for themselves are cared for in a correct way. But going back sort of the Walter Block thing, it's that like old economist joke or whatever, where they say, like, the one economist says to the other economist, "How's your wife?" And the economist says, "Compared to what?"
Right.
And like that's the joke or whatever. And so it's like, yeah, so CBS can come and take a kid out of being beaten by his parents, but if he puts him into a situation where the foster care people are raping him, well, comparatively, the kid probably should be beaten. Mm-hmm. Like it's a bad situation, but that's the situation that the state has set up.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that a lot of people have in their mind that trying to talk about something like this is that because it's very emotional. We don't like, no one likes to think about this stuff and entertain it, but it's the reality. But people want to have that perfect solution. They never want to have to admit that, you know what? Given the choices that we have, this really awful thing is the better one. But yeah, I don't know what to tell these people other than look at it's reject it. It's the Nirvana fallacy that they'll reject kind of the market solution because it's not perfect. But meanwhile, it's like, well, look at what you have now. Right.
Well, and this used to come up, and we'll kind of like put the more emotional child stuff aside for a second, is when I lived in Norfolk, this used to come up a lot when I would argue with like big government liberals about mass transit. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that like I would bring up a lot was that, well, there's no system or whatever where mass transit is profitable or even revenue neutral outside of East Asia. And the reason East Asia is actually revenue neutral is because, and actually this is not the case anymore, they're actually losing money again, but is because of the population density. And so I would say stuff like, I'd say, well, we could have the light rail system, which was on the ballot in Norfolk at the time, was to try to get light rail from Norfolk to Virginia Beach. And I said, you could spend all of this money on light rail and it won't be used, or we could have, assuming that we have the government paradigm or whatever, we have roads that already exist. We have expansion lanes that are not open all the time. We could open the expansion lanes to buses. Buses are a fraction of the price, and you could just have direct bus lanes that are exclusive for these buses, so they would be express. Right. From this place to that place or whatever. And the response always was, well, we should be able to do both. And it's like, well, but we don't have the money to do both. It's like, well, we should. It's like, yeah, I get it, but sometimes you have to make a decision. Like there's sometimes an either or. And right now, like in the statist paradigm, we were faced with no light rail and expanding busing, or no light rail and no busing and just leaving the roads the way that they are, which was probably fine. And like, so you have these different options. And a lot of times, like people, when they're seeing a situation, and kind of, then we'll bring this back over to the children type thing, is they see a situation, they go, this kid is being spanked and I don't agree with spanking, so I want CPS to come in and get him. Or this parent's not vaccinating his kid and I think they should be vaccinated, so I want CPS to come in and get it, or whatever. And you're like, yeah, but the alternative is, so yeah, you could have CPS come in. Maybe they should be vaccinated. Maybe they shouldn't. I don't know. But you could have CPS come in and get the kid. And the whole process of getting the kid itself is traumatizing. Sure. Like they burst in the door. A lot of times they mess it up. They end up hurting the kid. So there's a lot of situations like that. But so you've got that aside, you're taking a kid for not getting vaccinated. You take him, he gets vaccinated, great, he's fine or whatever. And then you put him in a foster care system where some foster parents are great, but a lot of them are not. They get put into a foster situation where he's a paycheck or she's a paycheck. And the foster parents do not give a shit. They put them into school where the state covers 2 meals. They also cover extended care with a snack. They get home, they make them a grilled cheese, they send them to bed, and that's it. Or they could be in a situation where they have loving parents who don't believe in vaccination and feed them healthy 3 meals a day, give them the care that they need, make sure that they're physically healthy in all other ways other than the vaccination or whatever. And this kid is probably going to be healthier in that situation where they have a balanced diet and loving parents and a supportive environment than a situation where they did get the vaccination and they're fed 2 school meals, a school snack, and grilled cheese at the end of the day from somebody who doesn't give a shit about them.
Yeah, I think the answer should be pretty clear. But to go back to what you said about the light rail example, just to play devil's advocate a little bit. All right, it's one thing to say that, I agree that it's for people that say, well, we should just be able to do both, spend the money to have both light rail and using the highway and buses to achieve the transportation. But Jacob, we're not talking about trains and buses and roads here. We're talking about kids, and I don't think we should put a monetary value on the health and safety and well-being of children. So, to say that the government doesn't have enough money, or someone doesn't have enough, you have to make these economic decisions about kids like that. I think that's horrific.
Yeah, well, and I would agree to that, except for that so if you look at the way that CPS is funded in most places, is that CPS is funded based on the previous year's spending. So if let's say that CPS spends $10,000, right, in 2019, well, in 2020 their base funding is $10,000. That's their base. That becomes their new base. So in 2020 they spend $15,000, right, and that becomes in 2021 their new base, $15,000, right? And so you can have an ever expanding budget, and that's fine. This is how CPS works. At least in California and Texas, this is how it works. Is that's how they determine funding. But if you look at actually the line items in that, the place that is easiest to spend money is seizing kids and putting them to foster care. And then inside the foster care system, one of the easiest ways to increase spending per child is to put them on medication. And in a lot of the cases when they're put on medication, there is a series of economic incentives in favor of that, which is you can get all the spending you want if you think that spending more money is going to solve the problem, but it doesn't. So in the case, like say, like, is it a psychologist or psychiatrist that's allowed to prescribe medication? I think it's a psychologist. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. Oh, it's the other way. Victoria's saying it's a psychologist. So, oh no, a psychiatrist. Okay, so Victoria says a psychiatrist that can prescribe medication. So a psychiatrist is allowed to prescribe medication. So, in Texas, at least, this is the example that was on Mance Raider's show, but I looked it up to make sure it was true because to me it sounded insane. So a psychiatrist gets paid a certain amount of money for a 15-minute visit with a child, 10 minutes with a child, 5 minutes with the either foster parents or adoptive parents. If the parent's not adopted, then the state pays for these psychiatrist visits. The psychiatrist gets paid more if they write the kid a prescription or increase their dosage. So the way that like they laid it out, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but the way they laid it out is that given the amount of time, if a psychiatrist works for 8 hours a day, they can see 32 children a day, and they can make, if all of those kids are on drugs, they can make several $100,000 a year just by making sure that they prescribe the kids. And they're not necessarily helping the kids. Now, I'm sure there's great psychiatrists that do a good job, but the way that the system is set up is not incentivizing them for that. And then if the kids get taken out of foster care, the child attorney is no longer employed by the child theoretically, but paid by the state. So like you have all of these incentive structures that do increase the spending. So yeah, theoretically it would be great if you could have both, and you shouldn't. And yeah, maybe for kids you shouldn't be concerned about the dollars and cents, but as Mises pointed out, humans act and humans respond to incentives, and the incentive right now for the bureaucracy that is surrounding these kids is to increase spending in the easiest way possible. And the easiest way possible is put them on drugs and take them away from their folks. That's the easiest.
And that's great. I mean, that's just it's absolute absurdity, and it's especially absurd because that's the criticism that people make of the market is that everyone's just out to make a buck. Okay, yes, that's true. But
sure,
they're only able to make a buck if they're satisfying the needs of the consumers.
Right.
Whereas in this situation, it is just so abundantly obvious that, the outcome, because like you said, with how the incentive structures align. So it's you just want to pull these people's eyes open and say, look at what you're saying and look at what's happening.
And one of the big complaints that was on Pete's show about this was that in a lot of cases, the social workers are between like 20 and 25 years old. They've never had kids. They don't understand a lot of the situation. And they also have never had power in their life. And now they're all of a sudden given all of the power. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, they gave several anecdotes, and this is, granted, is anecdotal, so this is not the case in all cases, but a lot of these people are college graduates that don't really have a very useful degree, and this is the only type of work they're going to get. And the structure is incentivized for them to bring more work to their agency, which is they're quasi-private, but it's liberals and like left-wingers and stuff. They complain about the prison industrial complex, and rightfully so, should be complaining about the foster care industrial complex. It's very similar. It's also one of the things that, and they talk about this a little bit on Mance's show too, is that this is actually, they're trying to create a pipeline to the prisons for these kids. A huge number of the kids that go through the foster care system end up in prison and become the same thing. And in places like California or the Northeast, I'm not sure what the statistics are for Texas, but a lot of these like private prisons are given contracts based on 90% occupancy rates. And so if they're not at 90% occupancy, then they don't receive the amount of money, but they're promised that. And so the government tries to funnel as many people into this system as they can. So you end up going through a terrible foster system, and then they graduate you to where you've been medicated your entire life, and they take all the medication away from you because now you're 18 for, you just crossed that arbitrary boundary. You're 18, they take a lot of this medication away from you, and now all of a sudden you're in a situation where you kind of do end up going into crime or something like that, stealing to get the medications you need. Like a lot of these kids, when they actually do get adopted, and in some cases they do, in like the case on Pete's show, is they took them to like another doctor, and the doctor was telling them, like, this kid shouldn't be on this number of medications. It is probably going to kill him. But at that point, they were addicted to the medication. Mm-hmm. So they had to like put them through withdrawals to get them off of the medication. And can you imagine at 18 years old, you turn 18 and then all of a sudden your prescription's cut off? Like, what are you going to do to make sure you get that prescription?
Whatever you have to.
Yeah. And a lot of them are opiates. So you're going to turn to heroin, or whatever, or pills, whatever you can get your hands on. And, that funnels you into the prisons. And so, to kind of not to like continuously complain about the government, which is, we do tend to do that a lot, is what would a better solution? And so what is a solution that we could have right now? And one thing that I've been kind of mulling over in my head, and you and I've talked about this on the chat, and Slappy, I think you probably heard me talk about this a little bit on the chat, is like one of my like grand ideas for libertarianism or like anarchism or whatever is the Libertarian Legal Defense Fund. And after like seeing a lot of these cases and seeing that a very large component of the foster system is the child's attorney, is possibly using the Libertarian Legal Defense Fund not just to defend people for parking tickets and stuff like that, which was my original idea, was just to make it a nightmare for municipalities to try to prosecute parking tickets for poor people. So like if you're going to get $40 or whatever from a parking ticket, but you have to spend $3,000 fighting the Libertarian Legal Defense Fund to get this parking ticket, you're just going to stop giving parking tickets. That's my idea. But in this case, is something else that we could do that would be pro bono would be to offer pro bono child defense services to the system. So you offer an economic incentive to take the lower cost to the status setup system. So you've got these lawyers who right now take insane amounts of money from the CPS system. And if you start offering and actually the Catholics don't do it on the legal side, but Catholics actually kind of insert themselves into this by offering a lot of care for free or very, very low cost, so that the system isn't as burdened as badly. And so in Texas, actually, the Catholic Church does a lot of really good work in helping kids figure out where to get adopted. Like that's a big problem, is getting them out of foster care and adopted. But that's not how the state's incentive structure is set up. So if you can get a legal structure where you have liberty-minded lawyers coming in, reviewing the cases and going, wait a second, this kid was taken from his parents and their only crime is that they were poor. Right. They couldn't pay.
They had to pay parking tickets.
Yeah, and that can be the case. Is a lot of times a lot of these kids are taken because their parents are incarcerated for something, and a lot of times it's incarceration for things that are, or their living situation is affected to the point where it's not a quote unquote safe environment anymore, because they are affected by taxes and fees and things like that from the municipality. So like, and this is not like, I'm not making this up, is there are situations where somebody gets a $40 parking ticket, then they're not able to pay it because they're destitute. Like they don't have a lot of money. They do have kids and they're just barely making it by. They get a $40 fine. They can't pay it. That fine is then sold to a quote unquote private. I always call them semi-private because they're not really private. They're really cronies. But that debt is then sold to the crony organization. The crony organization then has the right to start implementing interest payments on it. And you get a $40 parking ticket that ends up being several $1,000s. And then once it passes the point where it's no longer a misdemeanor, that person can then be incarcerated.
So it's legalized loan sharks.
Yeah, basically.
That actually have more teeth behind their enforcement of the.
So and if you're,
I didn't know that happened.
Oh, it does. Yeah, it happens a lot. And if you're a young single mother, and this happens to you, and then you become incarcerated, and you have 3 kids, well, what happens to your kids when you become incarcerated? They go into the CPS system, and you are very unlikely to ever see them again. You may see them again, but you're not going to be their parent anymore, and it changes the dynamic. And you may have been doing your best, but now you get a parking fine that turns into a $5,000 fine because it's sold off by the government to a collection agency. So part of the Libertarian Legal Foundation's the idea that I have for this and what I would like to get going at some point is to stop it there, where it's like, yeah, you got a parking ticket. So what we would agree to do is pay your parking ticket but you have to agree to let us fight it in court first. Mm-hmm. So if we lose, we'll pay it, fine. But in the meantime, we want to make the city pay as much as possible. And then they'll stop giving the parking tickets. Like I got one recently, a parking ticket where I thought about fighting it, and it was a situation where I was clearly in the right. The sign that said no parking wasn't there. There was one at the very, very end of the road, and I could see where, like after I got the ticket, I saw where the sign should be because there was like a little bracket on the floor. And so somebody had hit it probably and it had fallen over, and then somebody took it away and they hadn't put a new one up. But it was like a $75 parking ticket. And in my situation, I have no kids. My wife and I make decent money. $75 is not a big deal. But I thought about going to court. But when I thought about going to court, I was like, I'll have to be there all day long. I may get a continuance, so it may not even be heard that day. And my pictures of the situation may not be admissible because they're taken by me. They're not taken by like a law enforcement officer or a parking enforcement officer or whatever. So like I think about all these things when I'm going there, and I'm like, I should go and I should make it cost them money. But honestly, if I don't go to work that day and it costs me money. I charge quite a bit of money I'm a software developer. I charge quite a bit of money for my work hourly. And so if I'm not at work charging other people for my work, I'm losing money for my company, which makes me less valuable of an employee. And they're counting on that. But if we could set up a situation where you don't have to miss work, we can represent you as your legal team or whatever, and be funded by donations. And then what we can do is we can represent people who can't really miss work. And people like me, it's not that big of a deal. Like, that's sort of the socialist mindset is I can afford it or whatever. But I could afford it. But there are certain circumstances where like a single mother with a couple of kids who's barely making it, she can't afford $40 and she can't afford to miss work. And they're just trying to funnel her into the system so that whoever owns the prison or whoever's got the contract for the prison and whoever's got the contract for the collections. And that's the other thing too, is that collection agency, the work that you do in prison, they're going to get some of that money. So it's legalized slavery. And then in addition to that, then you've got now 3 kids in the CPS system who are making a bunch of money that you three, or you two and me, us 3, have to pay for. We have to pay for their medication that they probably shouldn't be on, the foster care that's probably not adequate, the legal services that are also not adequate, and the fact that they're going to be moved around and probably abused. Like statistically speaking, the possibility of them being abused in foster care is very high. Mm-hmm. So it's a really bad situation.
Yeah, no, and I think that legal defense fund I think is a brilliant idea, and one that we should work on. And that brings up such a good point too, that like these people are probably like teetering on the edge, and that parking ticket could just kind of push them over the edge, and they're probably on the edge because of government inflation and a really bad monetary system. And the war on drugs and everything else. And so just that last little nudge. I mean, it's tough. It's real tough to be in that situation as it is. Someone who's on the poorer side of society. You have all the deck stacked against you because of all that stuff. Inflation is just eating. You can't save. You have no ability to save money. There's a good chance that your father's in prison because of a stupid drug charge.
Right.
And, they're still able to hold it together, and then a parking ticket.
Right. Well, we used to actually get coached on this. I used to do taxes. One of the things I used to do was tax preparation for Liberty, and or Liberty Tax is which is kind of a funny name. But I used to do tax prep, and one of the things that I used to really hate was these rapid refund loans or whatever they're called, and I used to hate doing it because I was like, this is stupid. They're going to get a loan for like $300 or whatever is they're going to be their refund. But they're going to be paying like 50% in interest to Liberty Tax. And I was like, I really don't want to push this. And they were like, look, you don't have to push it, But for a lot of these people that you're doing taxes for, that $150 that they need right now is the difference between their lights being on and off. And they're saying, look, yeah, I mean, we are taking 50%, but it's a time preference thing. They need to have their lights on now. They don't need their lights on 3 months from now when the government gives them their money. And I always thought that was very predatory. It is very predatory, I think. But it is not a situation that was set up by Liberty Tax. It's a situation that's set up by the IRS, who takes more money than they should from you all year long, and then takes a long time to give you the money back. And this kind of goes back to the whole settlement thing that you and I were talking about earlier today. Part of it is that the money takes forever to settle. Mm-hmm. So they may return it to you right away, but it takes 3 days for the money to settle in your account, so you can't pay your electric bill. And then you have an additional charge because you didn't pay your electrical bill to get the electricity turned back on. So now instead of it being like a $150 electrical bill, it's a $170 electrical bill because you have the reactivation fee or whatever it is. And so like as far as like an incentive structure goes, it makes more sense for you to pay 150% interest or whatever, or 50% interest on a loan for 10 days, so that you don't pay the $20 reactivation fee. Then it does make sense for you to live without power for 10 days while you wait for your refund to come back in, you know? So a lot of the structures that are set up by the government is designed to make people fail, or even if it's not explicitly designed that way, like giving them the benefit of the doubt, it ends up being that way because when the economic incentives line up, when you have force as your backing, the economic incentives line up to line the pockets of the people who have the ability to do this. So whether they're sinister or not sinister, I mean, we're all very smart people. And, you know, Mason on Tasting Anarchy, he and I talk about this all the time, is that like once in a while, like we'll see situations where like we could probably make money on this, where like you look at the difference between, you know, like a rapid refund loan or whatever from the IRS. That's a situation where you could be getting a 50% return in 10 days. Or even if you undercut them down to like 45%, you could be getting a 45% return on your investment in 10 days if you could offer somebody an instant loan. Mm-hmm. And all they have to do is sign over their refund check to you, because you know that the government's going to be good on that refund check, at least right now. So like there are these types of situations where you can see it. So like the people are smart, they're seeing this, and they may not be like, ha ha ha, I'm preying on the poor or whatever. They just see an opportunity, and they're like, look, this is the opportunity to set up. If I don't do it, somebody's going to do it. Like I can't get rid of the government. But then you've got like us over here kind of going like, yeah, this is a shitty situation. How do we get rid of the government from it?
Right.
And that is, I think, is kind of the difference is that next step or whatever, the next leap. Yeah,
it's actually caring to, or I don't want to say caring, but actually looking to look at what the root cause is of it.
Yeah.
Instead of just treating the symptom of it.
Yeah, I understand why, because it does take a mindset change a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I didn't mean to impugn them with any sort of malice.
Yeah. Well, I just kind of what I wanted to, I guess, reinforce on that is I get it. Like it's not that, it's that like actually this even goes back to what we were talking about earlier with that, is that if you live in a society where the normative state is government predation, most people are not going to think of that as a bad thing. So like if you lived in, 300 BC Athens and you were like, yeah, you know what, I don't think we should be raping little boys, everybody else would be like, what's your problem?
Right.
Like, so like that's like the normative state. But the person who says, yeah, I don't think we should be raping little boys, to us that seems very obvious, but in that case, that's a hero. I mean, just to go back only 150 years in our history, or 170 years, I guess, in our history, is you had people like Lysander Spooner in a milieu or whatever of people who were like, yeah, we should own black people. And he was going, I think that's bad.
Yeah, it's very easy for us to beat our breasts today and say, oh, slavery's so bad. Well, yeah.
Right.
Everyone thinks that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like it's so brave to say that, but it's like, no, like the next, the most brave, like not the most brave thing, but like a brave thing that you could say today is stop cutting the tips of your kids' dicks off. Like that's like, like just don't do that. Like it's not. Now I wouldn't say it that. I wouldn't phrase it that way. Like I do. We actually had this conversation in the chat as well. I don't think it's useful to phrase it that way, right. But it's useful to advocate, peaceful parenting or whatever. And instead of like saying like you beat your kids or whatever, when you're referring to spanking, like you could say like, well, I understand like why you would spank kids or whatever, but it actually, the evidence shows that it's better for kids if you deal with them in a different way. And a kid, like it's sort of like a dog. Like I don't like punch my dog in the face when they do something I don't like, because they don't understand why they're getting punched in the face, right?
Right.
Like I don't want my dogs to be afraid of like. I don't want them to be afraid of me. I want them to learn right and wrong and have like an incentive structure to do what's right and wrong. And same thing for a kid. Like I don't want my kid to like do what is right because he's afraid that somebody's going to like spank his butt, So
yeah, I mean, well, that's just like the Christian idea of a conscience and everything, and like why do you do good things? And
right.
It's not good to be a good person because you're afraid of going to hell.
Yeah.
Like that's a very childish state of acting, and you should not be in that state.
Right. Well, it's actually like the parable of the rich man like dropping the change in the offering plate, and like he like drops it in there and it jingles and jangles and everybody sees it and they're like, oh, he's so great because he's putting all this money in. Mm-hmm. But like the old widower woman who puts like her very tiny amount of money in very quietly, like that's the one who's actually more noble.
Right. Because
she did it because she cares to give an offering to God, whereas the other guy did it because he wants everybody to see him.
Yep.
And that's kind of the same situation, I think, is that like you can, that's not exactly the same situation, but I guess it kind of is that like you can get your kids or your dog or whatever to act correctly by beating them. But they're not going to act correctly because they love you. They're going to act correctly because they're afraid of you. And I think that really, if like retirement wasn't socialized, the people who beat their kids would
good luck getting taken care of.
Yeah, exactly. Good luck. Like right now, you get taken care of by Social Security, but like in 50 years, good luck. If you're a shitty parent, your kids are not taking care of you, and Social Security is not going to be there for you. Like there's a natural process to, it's an ebb and flow, sunrise, sunset, or whatever it is. If you take good care of your kids, you take good care of the people in your life, when you need them, they'll be there for you, not because they're afraid of you, but because you were there for them.
Yep.
And that's the situation. Like, even though I got spanked and was circumcised and all that sort of stuff, and I complain about that, like my parents were awesome parents. And it doesn't matter, like my dad's in the military, it doesn't matter if his pension is there for him or if Social Security is there for them or not, we're going to take care of them.
Yep.
We'll figure it out. And my grandmother, who's very old now, same thing. She's awesome and was a great grandmother and all that sort of stuff. And she's got 7 kids and like a bajillion grandkids that will take care of her because she's been so awesome. And that's the situation you want to cultivate. Is you want to cultivate a society of people who are grateful rather than a society of people who are fearful.
Yeah, and too, it's just it just goes to show that all these government programs, and I think framing Social Security that way is brilliant because it just shows how it is so destructive to the family.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Because it just
very much
destroys the incentive structure that should otherwise be there.
I
forget what I was going to say about something else. You cover so much stuff, but it's really important though to cover all of this because I had no idea that we were going to talk about everything that we did, but all of this stuff is tied together. All of this stuff matters and plays into each other. So it's and it's really always drumming down to the same thing. It's a perverse incentive structure.
Yeah,
and so I think it's when we can look at any sort of government involvement into the market and show that perverse incentive. And when you frame it this way with the child abuse and CPS type stuff, then it makes the answer so much more obvious.
Yeah. But it's very difficult to unravel a lot of that. And I think I understand why. Like, it is one of those situations. We joke about this a lot of times in like libertarian community is like whenever anybody goes, well, what about the children? Immediately people want to do whatever you're saying is the correct thing for the children. Mm-hmm. And especially if it seems obvious when it's not necessarily obvious, And so I guess to reiterate like our original point is you may violate the NAP in the moment as a strategic option, I guess, in the expectation that you'll be forgiven. But the difference between a free society and a status society is that if you make a mistake, you're liable for it.
Right.
And that lines up the incentive structure correctly.
Yep. And that is the biggest flaw of a central planning system, is that there is no penalization for making the wrong decision, or at least it's not as strong. Right. And you're not being penalized by the people that are being harmed by your decision.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, that was great. I think that's just what's great about, because this is one of the harder topics that I think is out there, just because it is dealing with kids, and like you said, it's emotionally charged. What about the children? But I think if you can work these ideas out, then a lot of the other stuff becomes just way more obvious.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think that's one of the reasons why Walter Block I've mentioned a couple times. He's one of my favorites economists, and he does tackle a lot of these issues that are super hard, and he puts them as boiled down and as blunt as possible, so that you're faced with a situation that you're like, I shouldn't have to make that choice, but if you have the faculty to think about it in that way and sort of set aside the prejudice that you have in the moment, like going like, well, no, I shouldn't have to choose between starving and rape. Yeah, you shouldn't. I agree. And in utopia, you wouldn't have to, but we don't live in utopia. Sometimes you do have to make choices like this. And I mean, there's a very popular movie about it, Sophie's Choice. Like sometimes you do have to choose. One of your kids lives, one of your kids dies. And the government doesn't solve that situation. Like, it may absolve you of the responsibility and make you feel better, but ultimately the responsibility is up to us to keep an eye on our neighbors, and our neighbors to keep an eye on us, and for all of us to hold each other responsible, so that these types of situations don't arise to the best of best of our abilities. Is that in a free society, our organizations would keep an eye on that. And if there's that one dude in the neighborhood who has like a kid with like a diaper full of shit and that's like got flies all over them or whatever, we should go ahead and be like, you know what? He doesn't want us to take the kid, but we're taking the kid. And then if it goes to court, the court will say, well, sorry, bud, you sucked at being a parent, and we're not taking action on this. It's not actionable.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny, too, that there's a couple maybe it was about a month or so ago that Slappy and I had an episode where we were talking about how government monetary policy creates dumb money. And you're kind of faced with the choice of, all right, well, you've got money, you want to save your money, you want to grow your wealth or maintain your wealth, and you can hold cash and you can just lose your value by inflation, or you can throw it into the stock market and probably not know what you're doing. Yeah. And it's just another example. It's like, well, we don't have good options, and it is what it is, but you can't really, it's difficult for most people to not only have those options. So what do? You make the best of a bad situation and hope that it works out. Well,
actually, I have a whole nother long rant about like how inheritance taxes and other types of tax and inflationary monetary policy erode the father-son relationship. Ooh. And because like fathers are incentivized to work more outside of the home, and that I think is disruptive to a father-son relationship. In the past, once the son reaches a certain age, he would go with his father and work in the fields or go hunting or whatever, and that would design a very good relationship. But even only 150 years ago or so, there was an incentive for a father to teach his son wealth management, and that's a relationship reinforcer. Is that when an older generation can teach a younger generation how to do things like maintain wealth. But with inflationary practices, there is no incentive to teach your kids how to maintain wealth because the wealth is going to be gone. So, so you don't end up spending a lot of time with your kids to teach them these types of things. And because you're sort of incentivized to work outside of the home, incentivized to work far away where you can commute and that sort of thing. And also now even within the last 50 years or so, mothers are incentivized to work outside of the home as well. There's a lot of the whole economic structure is designed, whether it's designed this way or it's unintentional this way, is designed to separate children from their families. And so it creates, and I think this is one of the things it creates, and this is a whole long rabbit hole of like my own psychological analysis of society and stuff like that. But I think it is what creates a lot of depression in our society and a lot of angst. And also just like people's resentment toward their parents. I mean, when you go online, like the amount of people who hate their family is astronomical. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's really sad. I always hate seeing that.
Yeah.
Regardless of the situation, whether it's bad parents or just a kid who's an idiot. But no, I think that's a great topic, and just
it is
so much is there. And I even see,
and it's inflation. I mean, inflation does this. It creates what you and I've talked about a lot is a high time preference society, and a high time preference society doesn't put in roots and it doesn't build relationships.
Mm-hmm. And it's
bad.
Everyone complains about how schools don't teach people how to do financial planning or all this stuff, and it's like, well, one, why? I mean, you brought up the great point that that's what the parents used to do and probably should do, but at the same time, it's like, well, this school is there claiming that they are the source of the education, and they're not doing. So why are you saying why isn't the school doing this? They've already failed at it.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean Well, you see this actually in the great wealthy families of America. Is a lot of people that are like on the socialist type left would like show that like the degeneration of a wealthy family over the generations. But I think if you look at the timeline, it's a direct correlation to inflation. Mm-hmm. So as like the Rockefellers or whatever degenerate, or these other great wealthy families. They degenerate over time because inflation picks up. So you've got producers in the first generation, and then if you look at like all of the robber barons as they're called or whatever, when those families start to generate is as soon as the Federal Reserve is established. So you've got like the Chase the Chase family and like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. I mean, a lot of these people were involved in a lot of that stuff, but you can see that their own actions destroyed their families. So you see the Federal Reserve gets established, and then the next generation is like slightly shittier at business, and then the generation after that goes into philanthropy, and the generation after that goes into politics. And so it's like it's a degeneration of the generations because of inflation. Is that they start losing their wealth, and so they go from creating to maintaining, and then from maintaining to spending, and then from spending to setting up rules to make it so that they can continue to spend.
How many books and movies do we watch and read where the villain is ultimately destroyed by the thing he created?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and all these families were involved in that. Like the Federal Reserve was set up by some very powerful families who are now politicians mostly. I mean, their politicians are still in the banking industry, which is basically the government.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, that so much. I mean, that's what's so crazy about all this stuff. You could take one little thread and pull it and keep going and find all sorts of craziness and again, it's just all parallels because it's all the same problems. That's why I think that I really love the Austrian perspective. I really love kind of the Rothbardian libertarian perspective, because when you go down to first principles and try to really apply it there, I think like the praxeology is just so strong with showing these similarities and just the way humans act.
Yeah, exactly.
Therefore, and it all kind of falls into place. So.
Right. And it's a very, like, I think when you start thinking that way, and not everybody has a logical thought process. A lot of people think emotionally, which is why, like, you do when you're talking to people, you have to kind of gauge how their thought process works and frame your argument in a way that is more conducive to that. But if you have like a procedural thinker that you're talking to, a programmer or somebody like that is not a particularly emotional individual, you can lead them through a praxeological argument like that and be like, this, then this, then this, then this, and that is very compelling, and I think that's one of the reasons why in like the libertarian community we see a lot of people who are software developers or in sort of in that kind of field, something that's along those lines that takes a lot of logical thinking,
right?
And why we don't see a lot of emotional thinkers. So right. But there is a lot of my sisters are emotional thinkers, and so I do kind of try to think of ways to frame arguments that are more palatable to them, and they're much more interested in hearing. Like, one of my sisters is like a hardcore anti-vaxxer, which I don't really have a particular opinion of that. It's not something I know anything about, so I don't really take one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But I can frame arguments in such a way where I can be like, this is something I know that you're emotionally charged about, and there are facts about it. And she's not stupid, but she does get very emotional about things. So you can kind of go like, these are facts that you already know. And then I can say, well, these things that you already know, you realize that the bad thing about that is caused by inflation or caused by this organization and the government. And that sort of leads them to more of an emotional conclusion, but the emotional conclusion can be freedom as opposed to, tyranny. And it's just a different way of thinking. This is one of the things we were talking about in the chat, which I brought up earlier, which was I don't think it's a good way to. So I didn't realize who this person was arguing, and then Mel clarified it earlier. But this guy Matt Walsh was doing he was like arguing with people about like hitting your kids as a reference to spanking, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. But if you think that is a good way to get people who have kids that have already spanked their kids, if you think that's a good way to get them on your side, you're mistaken, because nobody wants to think, anybody who thinks of themselves as a good parent, nobody wants to think that they've caused brain damage to their kid, for example. So whereas
it's just like if you're at work or any sort of team where you have to make a decision, and a bunch of people have a bunch of different ideas, but you got to all kind of coalesce on one choice. And you don't just like have your idea. Even if your idea is actually the best idea, you don't just sit there and just like ram it down their throat and say, well, no, your idea was stupid. This is clearly better. You do it in a way that like you lead them along. I mean, that's what a leader is, leading people, but you lead them to deciding for themselves to agree. You don't just like dictate it to them. Like part of it's like you almost make people think that they're the ones that came up with the idea. But that's really what, especially with like convincing people of these ideas, that's what you want to do. You can't just, and I know it's especially on Twitter and stuff and on the internet, it's so easy to just take pot shots at people. Yeah. But if you're really interested in convincing someone, they got to ultimately make the decision on their own. Your job is to ask them questions and give them information that they didn't have or think of before, so that they can arrive at the conclusions they have. Because it's like no one likes being lectured to and being told, condescendingly being told, oh, how stupid you are.
Right. Well, and I think that's a good point. And this used to be something that I would, I have a lot of family and friends that are in Seattle who are they're in that culture, and they're very left leaning and stuff like that. And a lot of their conclusions would be stuff like, well, that's racist, or that's anti-LGBT, or whatever the deal is. And I found that like when you can kind of frame your argument in a way that is more appealing to them, it does sort of help lead them at least to something like secession. Secession, I don't think, is a controversial topic. You just have to lead people to that point of view. And I remember getting into one conversation. It actually wasn't with a relative. It was with this kid I know who was very left-leaning. And this was when the first time that the AR-15 stuff came up. And a lot of people were on Facebook and stuff were posting about it. So this was like maybe 2015, maybe a little earlier than that. And he said something along the lines of, like, I don't know why anybody would ever need this weapon of war. And I said, look, I get it. Like, it is a scary weapon, and it's a scary thing. But are you familiar with the Battle of Athens? And this was I think it was in the 30s or 40s. I think it was in the 40s. It must have been the 40s, because I know there was a bunch of World War II vets involved. But it was in Tennessee. There was this super racist government who had taken over this county, and they were not letting people vote, or they were taking the votes and then destroying the votes and that kind of thing. And the citizenry got together. The police were in the pocket of the government and stuff like that. And the citizenry got together, arrested the politicians, and arrested the police because they had guns.
Right.
And I gave him this example, and I made the story much more interesting than that. But I gave him a long thing, and I said, this is a situation where it's important for, and one of the big things about it too was that it was a predominantly black constituency, and the black vote was not being counted at all. They were all being thrown away. And so I said, this is a situation where it was important that these constituents were armed, because if they were not armed, they would have not been able to go and arrest the police. They wouldn't have been able to arrest the politicians. And his response to that was, he's like, look, wow, like, I've never actually heard a good reason why people should have guns. And it's because sometimes the people who are in charge of you are assholes and they have guns. So you have to have guns too. And you can lead people that through like an emotional argument. And this is an emotional thing.
Yeah, that's a pretty good example of just vote them out of office, wouldn't it?
It didn't. And they ended up actually, what's funny is that, like, they didn't actually throw the votes away. They just put them in these other boxes and locked them up. And so actually what the citizens did is they went and arrested all the police and all of the mayor and like a bunch of other people. And then they counted the votes. And the votes were to vote them out of office. And so they said, fine, okay, the votes have been counted now, and you are all fired. And so they fired everybody, and they put new people in charge. But they would have never been able to even see the votes if they weren't armed. And that's one of those situations where, like, you can kind of tell somebody a story, especially somebody who's an emotional thinker, is a story is much more important to them than facts. So, like, although this is a factual story, and it when you give it like a historical narrative and make it interesting to them, they're more likely to either hear it or learn from it than instead of going like, you know, if I was to like rattle off the numbers, I don't even know the numbers on it, but if I was like, there was 200 deputies in this town, and there was 365 citizens, and 325 of them were armed, but the deputies only had 50 guns or something, like, you know, if I was to give all of these statistics, they wouldn't give a shit. But right. Because it was a minority constituency, or actually the majority black constituency, so a majority minority community, which whatever that means, but you can target all of their soft spots. You got a minority, you've got voting because democracy is so important, and you've got and then you have these guns that they're afraid of, and you can kind of wrap those all together and present it in a package that's palatable. And make that something that they can consume, and that leads them a little bit closer. And I've had a little bit of victory with like family, like I said, that lives in like Seattle or LA or San Francisco, that kind of area, when we may still totally disagree on the function of government and that sort of stuff, but we do at least agree at this point that like Texas and California can't be in the same country anymore. Like we're just not. We're not the same people. We're not the same culture. I don't want to live under what they want. They love me enough as a family member that they don't want to force me to live under what they want. And I care enough about them that I want them to live under the way that they want. But I want them to allow people who don't want to live that way out. And so that's kind of I think that's the situation you're going to build with, you know, whether it be with kids or guns or the function of government or any of that type of stuff. Is we're a long way off of a libertarian society where we use normative processes to decide this stuff and base things off of the NAP or whatever. What we're very close to, though, I think, and I think surprisingly close, I think maybe in the next 10 or 15 years we're going to see this, is I think that enough people are starting to go like, they have enough empathy to go, those people really hated being under Obama as much as I really hate being under Trump. And whether that's really not being displayed as much in like the mainstream or what we see a lot online, but I think enough people are starting to understand and have empathy for the other side that they're kind of coming to the conclusion that we don't agree enough to be in the same society, and it's time to kind of break up. And you see this a lot more on Twitter and Facebook nowadays than we did maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where people are showing like, this is the way I envision the United States being divided up, or this is the way I envision California being divided up, or Texas being divided up, or even Virginia right now with the whole gun stuff that's going on with like a bunch of the counties in Virginia where people are like showing maps and they're like, these counties want to join West Virginia. And it's like, let them. And now like left wingers are saying, yeah, I don't really want them I don't want them voting in my place. And at least, I think, thankfully, and I think this is maybe a testament to the culture of the United States, is that they're not at the point where they're like, well, we'll just exterminate them all. they're like, no, we'll let them go. We'll just split up.
Right.
Which is good.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, I mean, I'm right on board with you, and I think that the reason that we can have a normative society in kind of this libertarian world that we're talking about is because we kind of live in that normative society today, just because the government can only exist because it has the consent of the governed. So as soon as people decide that, hey, you know what, I don't really think that whatever we have is really the best way of doing this, then it's not going to be able to exist. Just like with how Uber broke up the taxi medallion monopoly, is that they just decided, well, wait, this is kind of silly. We have this other thing, so it's not going to be. It doesn't have to be this explicit rejection. Just put something in the hands of people that's better, and they're going to just choose that and reject the previous one. And it's real hard to take something away from people once they got a taste of it. So.
Yeah, well, I think I'm hopeful too. I think that Bitcoin is going to play a big part in that, or crypto in general, digital currencies, especially if it moves as fast as it seems like it's moving. Is that, I mean, like we see this actually with like the 3D printing of guns right now. Is that like 3D printing of guns is 10 or 15 years ahead of regulation as it is, and the pursuit of regulating that is silly. And I think that people who know the space already know that it's silly, and so they just don't care about the regulation anymore. And that's why you kind of see people leaving that and just going straight to home manufacturing. And I think we're going to see a similar thing in Bitcoin, and already are seeing this in Bitcoin and other crypto spaces, is the speed at which people are adopting digital currencies as opposed to traditional fiats is so fast that they're just not going to be able to keep up with it. And that's where you hit it like the singularity or whatever they call it, where it's like it just gets to that point and then that's it. So I think it'll be definitely one of those things where like overnight we won't even notice it, but it'll just be like we'll be talking about now. We'll be like, remember in 2020 when like we were worried about the government doing these types of things, and then it's going to be like, well, the United States doesn't even exist and it's only 2025.
Yeah, we're not even going to, like, it's going to be difficult to, like, remember what it was even like. Like, remembering what life was like before the internet. We're both old enough that a long part of our lives, probably about half of our lives, didn't really have much of an internet access. At least
I got internet in 92.
Oh,
but,
wow.
but it wasn't the way it was now. Sure. It was Encarta and chat rooms. And that was like, and being able to like send emails sort of, and the emails were even different than they are now. So yeah, I mean, it is, but I mean, like, I think even a more stark example is, we were out of high school when smartphones came out. Yeah. And like, it's weird to think about life without a smartphone.
Yep.
And to think of a world without cryptocurrency now, because it is becoming a large portion of the economy quickly.
Did you see that? Did you see that Jack Mallers came out with the Strike app, where you can pay,
no, I didn't.
You can pay a Lightning Network invoice from your bank account or debit card.
Oh, actually, yeah, you were telling me that.
Yeah, and you don't you don't have to touch anything with Bitcoin.
That's pretty big deal.
I don't know how he does it, and I'm sure he's going to be on a lot of podcasts explaining it, but like, that is a huge, his Medium post introducing it is worth reading it. Guy Swan from the Crypto Economy podcast that was one of his things.
That is huge, because there's a lot of people, probably you guys included, and like other people in like the podcasting space who take all of their money and they accept crypto, but they also accept all of the fiat and stuff like that. If they could just accept fiat, but it come into them as crypto, that's a big deal for them.
Yeah, and two, it's to onboard people to start interfacing with Bitcoin a little bit, because that's kind of what Jack Mallers was saying, was that first we were trying to make Bitcoin easier, Bitcoin Lightning specifically, Bitcoin and Lightning easier for Bitcoiners, but then he realized, like, no, that's not what we need. The Bitcoiners, people who are into it now, they already know how to run a node, they know how to do the seed and everything. You got to get people like your grandmother who can kind of use the legacy stuff, but they have like the great example is the internet again, where your grandparents will say, "Oh, I'm never going to use the internet." Well, they're using the internet. They don't even realize it. They don't realize when they're calling you on the phone on their landline, they'll criticize cell phones and the internet all day, but that's voice over IP. They're not using telephone lines anymore. They don't even realize that they've onboarded the internet. Yeah, and that's exactly. This is kind of the same type of thing, that you're onboarding people into Bitcoin and they have no idea.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's really, it does bridge. And that was actually the last time I was on with you guys, and we were talking about Bitcoin. Is like, that's one of the big things that I saw as like sort of a barrier to crypto. And actually it sort of reinforced it when you had last episode. Who was that you had on again?
JW. For the cold storage?
No. Was it JW Weather? That wasn't JW Weatherman. That was, who was it that was on the last episode? It was the
very last episode, American HODL.
Yeah, HODL. Yeah, that's right. Like you guys were talking about a lot of this stuff, and you would mention things, and I was kind of like, well, yeah, but the problem, a lot of that is like, so like this actually kind of goes back to the whole thing that we've been talking about tonight, is that it's sort of like a perspective thing. It's like there are advantages to Bitcoin that are only advantages to people who care about those things. So like being able to secure your own wallet or secure your own wealth and all that sort of stuff, that doesn't matter to people who don't know about it. Mm-hmm. Right. So like people who go to the bank and they're like, my money's secure in the bank, it's FDIC insured or whatever. And it never occurs to them that that's bullshit. Right. Like that. So when you're like, yeah, but this is more secure, they're like, okay, but I don't really care. So like getting those types of people to adopt it is difficult because they're just not in the mindset for it. So like the idea of security, the idea of like anonymous transactions and things like that, to them are not, it's not important. And so why would they use this as opposed to using fiat? But when you can kind of bridge that gap by making it to the point where they can pay you and me in crypto and not know that they're paying us in crypto, that bridges the gap. Mm-hmm. So they can continue to use whatever the heck they want to use. And they probably don't care what they're getting paid in, as long as it converts to something they understand.
Right. And then too, like to maybe onboard them, that's why I like the number go up meme. Yeah. Because that's very easy to understand. One's getting, I mean, that's how monies have changed, how new monies have been adopted just because of Thier's law. People will, to save, they're going to just naturally go with the better one. They don't have to necessarily explain why or what. They just do it. Just like every other adoption of every other new technology. I mean, someone using, drafting, doing like drawing and, have the big draft tables and everything and all the tools. And then they get a computer and have AutoCAD. Right. They don't have to understand programming, but hey, I can draw a perfect circle and copy it instantly and, do the work of 10 people in 10% of the time. Yeah. Yeah. it's just,
well, I mean, like, and you think about it too, is like, that's not even that old. It like the Concorde jet was designed by hand. Yeah. Before AutoCAD. Like that's crazy. Yeah. And that's still one of the most advanced passenger jets. Mm-hmm. But that all was done by hand. Like, and I mean, this will get back into like a whole other line of criticism of the government, why we don't have Concorde jets and things like that. But like that kind of stuff is like, it's not that old. Like the world is changing really fast.
And in that exponential area.
Yeah. It's freaky. It's freaky to think about it, but it's also weird because you operate in your day-to-day life not realizing it. And like, I mean, like the thing that actually got me kind of interested in what was going on in Bitcoin and crypto was the Cash App. It wasn't even like you talking about it or anything like that. Like I kind of knew about it. Like in the last episode we talked about this. Like I knew about it like back in like 2003 or 2013, maybe 2012, around that, because I knew somebody who was interested in it, but I didn't get it. But then like Cash App made it real easy, and then like from there, like I was like, oh well, this is interesting and it's easy. And then I started seeing things like self-executing smart contracts being on the Lightning Network and things like that, where like that's more interesting to me than the money portion. And then this, like these last couple of weeks, buying a house, where I'm like, all of this should be automated and in a program. Like, why do I have to have an escrow? Like this is retarded. It should just be in a contract on a blockchain somewhere. And when we both fulfill our side of the contract, we enter the keys, and then the funds are distributed. And if one person doesn't enter the key, then we have a third party that can mediate a dispute. You know, like there's way easier ways to do this than like escrow, which is like 3 days of settlement. Then they hold it, and they're making interest on this money the entire time, plus whatever escrow fees I have to pay to them. And so they're making interest. They've got the escrow fees. They're holding the money. It's a third party that's completely unrelated, which could easily be automated by a program. And like, I'm not talking to the person who's selling the house. And then we also have to have this like we each have to have mediators on our, like, theoretically I could be my own real estate agent. They could theoretically as well, but like, it's not, because of all of the bloat and regulation, and most of it's not even like, the process of buying a house is not so complicated. It's the money portion of it that's complicated, and making sure that like this money goes to this guy, and like this thing, like this has to go there, but this takes 3 days to settle. This takes 10 days to settle. This takes, it's all insane. Whereas like all of this stuff could ease, like the deed could be on a blockchain somewhere. I'm not, there's still a lot of work to be done on that, but like that's something that I think is really interesting, is digitizing and putting it and distributing deeds, so that the deeds are not like at a central location somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of can do like a colored coin. Yeah, that's possible now. There's it's actually pretty simple to do. I don't know how much. I mean, I think that might like bloat. I don't think it's a very efficient way of doing it, and I think it kind of creates, well, it's not efficient and right now, but like that's one of the things I think is going to be coming out of the technology, is that as this becomes more efficient, and then you have the Internet of Things talking to each other, where you can incentivize people based on transaction fees to run a full node on their refrigerator or something like that. You're going to see like the cost of these things come down, because computing comes down in price. Or if people are like running these nodes on like oil flares, like when they flare off the gas. I think you and I talked about that actually. Right. So like they flare off the gas on like these things, so they could run full nodes or do calculations or whatever. Wherever they're doing it, like people are going to start putting these places because there is an incentive, and you can incentivize people not just on rewards for mining the next block. You can incentivize people with transaction fees, which if that's just built into your network, like this is one of the things that is coming in, the way that you and I've talked about. This is way off topic, but you and I've talked about this, where it's like you can see from vine to bottle where your wine comes from. Mm-hmm. And so like one of the ways that they're trying to incentivize people to, and it's nobody's doing it yet, but this is like one of the ideas, is that in order to incentivize people to run these nodes, to like to verify it and stuff like that, is to have a transaction fee at each point, but also that when you have a certification agency who certifies that this wine is biodynamic or organic or whatever, that when they don't get paid until the contract has reached full maturity, which is when the bottle goes on the shelf. And so there has to be verification at each stage, and then part of the final product, it's built into the product, is that it costs an increment larger. I mean, because when you're talking about the certification, you're certifying thousands of bottles of wine at one time. Each bottle is $20 or whatever. Let's say you make the cost of the bottle $20.25 to just to round it up, and then you've made 1,000 bottles, and
25 cents of each bottle is part of the transaction fee. That goes back in to incentivize people to run the node. The people who are running the nodes get a small percentage of that to confirm the blocks. And then also when the contract is fulfilled, the money gets released to the certification people. Mm-hmm. So there, it's all built in. The contracts have to be solid, obviously, but this is stuff that I think is going to start being automated, and it's not going to be very abstract to think about anymore. It's just going to be that, oh yeah, Samsung puts, they sell the space. Half of the space is to regulate your laundry, and half of the space is to run either a partial node or a full node of this blockchain that confirms wine. Like it's just part of you buying the product, and you could disable it or opt out of it, but like most people are not going to do that.
Yeah, and I think that'll be an interesting thing as side chains start getting developed, and because they're like Liquid is starting to gain some traction, and they're starting to do some like it's like platform or exchanges are kind of using it for doing settlement. Yeah, but Bitcoin across it, so they don't have to pay like enormous transaction fees and everything. But
right.
It creates another way to kind of do whatever they're doing on the side to keep track of everything, while still leveraging the main network and all the power behind it. So
and each contract actually, like the way that I understand it, and still I'm like an infant when it comes to a lot of this stuff still, but the way I understand it is you can build it into the contract that the contract itself has its own wallet, and the money is locked up, and the key is not knowledgeable to anybody other than the program. Mm-hmm. So in order to unlock that, you have multiple parties have to enter their key to release the funds. And then once all the keys are entered for the program to execute, then the program itself unlocks the Bitcoin and then gives it to who the contract says it's supposed to go to.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's, when I talk to my parents and stuff about this, they're like, well, yeah, but what about all the people who are going to lose their jobs and stuff? And I'm like, yeah, but if this process can be automated, those people should be being more productive in other areas where it's something that can't be automated. Like it's going to make everybody so much richer just to have like this bullshit escrow crap digitized and automated. Like the escrow stuff is so frustrating to me because it's so dumb, but it does take a third party to be able to like, and I understand it. Like back, only 20 years ago, you did need a third party to be able to confirm this stuff, but now it's like we're in a different age.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like when the first money started kind of being developed, you didn't need that ledger to keep. Like maybe like the town elder had like this, like, because I think it was like Sumeria or something, or one of the first like really old kind of civilizations. They have these tablets they uncovered, and it was just like keeping tracks of debts for people. Yeah,
it's like those early cuneiform tablets. Right. Is just like it's like this guy has this and this guy has exactly. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Gold or some other sort of commodity money comes around, and it eliminates the need for that. And so we're just kind of on the next step of like, what do we need? What do we not need anymore to accomplish these things? So it's
right. Well, it does. It does. Yeah, it removes these middlemen, which not to denigrate middlemen or whatever, they do serve a purpose in certain circumstances, but like it's like all of the people who are employed by the banking industry, there is going to be some sort of banking still because there's going to be like loans, things like that. But I think it's going to be much more done on like a crowdsourcing type thing where people are like, I want to make some interest on my Bitcoin and I'm not using it right now. So I'll give it to this smart contract, and this smart contract is managed by so-and-so. And that's going to loan it out to this guy at like, 5% interest or whatever the deal is. And then at the end, I'm going to get like 1.05 of my Bitcoin back. So I gave 1 and now I get 1.05 or something like that, like at the duration of the, it's a whole time preference thing, but it's like all of those things right now where the bank has thousands of people employed to do that. It could be done. Like people don't always need loans that are that big. A lot of times it's micro loans that they need for just very small, particularly in like third world countries. This is where I think it's going to be a huge blow up in digital currencies, is places that don't have stable currencies as it is. And now you're seeing, and you saw this actually when in Cyprus not too long ago, and then actually even in Venezuela also recently, where people like you saw, and Brazil actually had this recently, where you saw a big increase in people using digital currencies because their own currency was not certain. And Cyprus had this. This was a huge deal in Cyprus when the government in Cyprus said, "Oh well, in order to pay like these debts, we're going to like seize 50% of everybody's bank account."
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the bank accounts were empty, and Bitcoin shot through the roof.
Yep.
And it was because people were like, "Oh, this is not a certain thing anymore. I want somewhere I can store wealth." And that's kind of where Bitcoin's at right now. It's not really a money yet, but it is a store of wealth. It's not, since its inception, it's never been worth zero. So it does have that going for it. But there's been lots of fiat currencies that are worth zero now, or lost at larger percentages. So, it does have its ups and downs and whatever, but it's still stabilizing. But there's a lot of good argument for it. Whether or not Bitcoin ends up being, I know that that's your preferred thing, and that you're a maximalist and you think it's going to be, and it does seem that way. It seems like it has staying power, which is good, and it has a lot of advantages over a lot of the other ones. But as far as its advantages over other fiat currencies right now, it does hold its value pretty well.
Right.
And so we're in a state where it's gone from like what I always equate it to like Pokemon cards, where I'm like, it's gone with the difference between like digital currencies and gold is that gold started out as like a commodity, which had practical uses, and Bitcoin started out as a hobby, more like trading cards, like Pokemon cards, and then became a commodity. So like there's a origins difference, which that's why like I do understand people who have kind of a like Peter Schiff and stuff like that, where they're like, well, but this is not a thing. It's like, well, no, it is a thing. It's a thing like Pokemon cards are a thing. Like Pokemon cards have value, and they're not. It didn't start out as the same type of commodity as gold, but it's not that it's not nothing. It is a thing. It's just a different type of thing. But now we're at the same place where they're both assets to be traded. But it seems to me that gold is more turning into less of a wealth holder and more of an industrial product, and Bitcoin is going. Which is interesting.
It's better for society too if gold becomes an industrial product, because we're not using gold everywhere where it should be, because we're using it as a money.
Well, and it's a great conductor. So like there's a lot of stuff that like electronics could be greatly improved if more gold was available at a cheaper price. Same thing with silver. And when you talk about like Bitcoin as like a digital currency and stuff, it doesn't have that. What people complain about a lot is like it doesn't have the intrinsic value, but it does actually have an intrinsic value. It's just not a physical intrinsic value. It is the value is something that not necessarily everybody values yet, but it's something that they're going to be increasingly valuing as the state grows and as fiat currency becomes more inflated. And its privacy is one aspect of it, but it's also like knowing that your transaction is settled quickly. Mm-hmm. Like that's a big deal.
Well, we've never had an asset or something that was only useful as money.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's odd, but like that's kind of the best thing, because like we just said, with gold or silver or bronze or whatever else people were using as money, that takes that supply away from what it would otherwise be useful for. By using Bitcoin, you're not sacrificing a physical good for its use in industry.
But you know what? And I think that though, even with Bitcoin, this is something that, because like, I'm a big comic book fan, and I've been involved in the comic book. I used to run comic conventions. Like that's one of the many things that I'm interested in. But one thing that I think people miss about Bitcoin, when I equate it to Pokemon cards, it's not like I'm not denigrating it or whatever, is if you had the opportunity, Rollo, to buy the first Bitcoin mined, and you could see that it was the first one, would you pay more than a more recent mined Bitcoin for that first Bitcoin? A lot of people would.
Right.
Because it's a collectible. So it does have that value, is that coins that were mined earlier are worth more as a collectible than coins that were mined later. And you see this in fiat money as well, is that older, and actually the fiat money does have, like dimes made out of silver or whatever. Everybody saves their dimes that are made out of silver because they're old, they're collectible, they're cool, but they're also worth more. Right. And coins that were mined earlier in Bitcoin are worth more from a collectible standpoint than coins that were mined later. So there may be a secondary market. You know, was a Satoshi? He mined the first 1 million Bitcoins, I think is what it was, yep. Right?
Yeah.
So if those ever, and they haven't so far from my understanding, but if those ever enter circulation, those are collector's items. People are not going to just spend those to spend those. They're Satoshi's 1 million coins. So if you could have one of the first million coins, that's pretty big. Mm-hmm. Oh, so yeah. They still do have a secondary value. Like gold has a secondary value as a industrial or a jewelry commodity. Bitcoin has a secondary value as a collectible. Mm-hmm. It's different.
And we can even kind of apply the reverse and say, well, not the reverse, but say like, well, why did Pokemon cards? Because they were and are collectibles, but why did they not? Yeah. Why could they not monetize? And it's because they're not difficult to produce.
Right.
If their supply got restricted and you couldn't just produce them willy nilly, then there's a good chance they would have monetized. It's crazy. Well, it's crazy to think, but. Yeah.
And the ones that were restricted are worth more. Mm-hmm. So like the ones that like the hologram ones and stuff like that we used to sell a lot of at the comic book store and stuff like that, they are worth more just because they are artificially restricted.
Right.
And you know what? We would actually get Chinese copies of them and stuff like that were fake. I used to get this a lot when I sold action figures too. Is the way I paid for college was by selling action figures on eBay, and so I have no college debt as a result of that, which is awesome. But one of the things that you had to watch out for when you were selling action figures was counterfeit action figures, which is a weird thing, but they're collectibles, and so you have to be able to certify that they're authentic, and especially when you're getting into action figures that are like $400 or $500 each. There are certain things that you have to make sure that you can give really detailed pictures of and show that, hey, this has got the hologram on it still. So, and it's never been opened and all that kind of stuff, because there were people making counterfeit versions of it. And that's what we got in Pokemon cards too, is people would come into the comic book store and be like, hey, I want to sell this like rare card or whatever. And we would look at it and we'd be like, well, this is clearly a fake. And they'd be like, what do you mean? I paid, $300 for it. I want to sell it. And we were like, yeah, but it's not real. It's a fake one. So we can't give you anything for it. You can still use it to play the game, but we won't pay you a lot of money for it. And like it's kind of the same situation. That's what's going on with like fiat, is that it's not scarce, it's fake. So
yeah. So I think we're almost 2 hours in, so I don't want to take up any more time. I gotta shove a pill down my cat's throat anyway.
That's actually I gotta do that for my dog.
He's on crazy pill. So, Jacob, why don't you tell everyone where they can find you and also what's going to happen this summer?
Okay, yeah, you can follow me at Tasting Anarchy on Twitter. You can also go to our Facebook, which I don't ever use, but it's there, and I do see it once in a while. So if you put a message there, I'll respond to it. Also, feel free to email us at tastinganarchy@gmail.com. Twitter is probably the best place, but I'll respond to the Gmails as well. And also listen to our podcast. It's Mason, my co-host, and myself talking about wine and how much government is in your drink. The wine industry is actually heavily regulated. The government is involved in all aspects of alcohol, have been for a very long time, and that's mostly what we talk about. We also do, though, reviews of wines or beers, whatever we're drinking that week, and that's what the show's about. We don't get into topics like this very often, but because we try to keep it mostly wine-centric, but it's always fun to kind of talk about other things I'm interested in. And so that's that. Now, this summer is Childeberg Dose. Rollo, you were at the first Childeberg. Mm-hmm. We've already got almost twice as many people signed up to come to Childeberg Dose as Childeberg 1. And it's going to be really cool. It's in Austin. It's in May. It's May 23rd through 26th. In Austin, it's at Emma Long Metropolitan Park. You don't have to remember that because you can go over to Childeberg on Twitter. It's in the description of Childeberg. And if you also want to email me at tastinganarchy.com, you can get the information there. Or you can go over to the Childeberg website, which is childeberg.com.
Nice, awesome. We'll see if Mason can defend his fruitcake championship.
That's right. He's actually good at that. He's a very good guesser. And you know what? Also, the proceeds, 50% of the proceeds from the fruitcake decision will go to freeross.org. And the other 50% go to the winner. And we hope that the winner does the right thing and donates those to freeross.org.
Yep. Mason set the precedent last year, and there will be not probably explicit pressure.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I will bring it up many times what Mason did with his winnings when it happened. So
yeah, it was great. I think we raised the equivalent of like $350 in Bitcoin and sent that over to Lynn to work on getting clemency for Ross, who has been very unjustly imprisoned for a double life sentence plus 40 years for hosting a website.
Yep. Yeah, that's it's really important that we help them out. And all that reminds me too, I have the BTC Pay server set up. So if you want to put that up on like Childerberg.com as a Bitcoin donation page, we can do that now.
Yeah, let's do that. I've taken a couple of donations just through my Cash App, but it'll be easier to do it that way.
Yeah. Alrighty. So Jacob, it was we ended up running the gamut on this one, but it was a lot of fun. Always great to talk to you. Everyone, if you have not listened to Tasting Anarchy, head over there. It is it's one of the podcasts, when I see it come up on my feed, I listen to it right away.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, between what you guys talk about with Liberty and just I'm always fascinated by the wine, talking about the wine and food and what you say about that. Thanks to you guys, I'm now kind of like into Tempranillo. So. Oh
yeah, that's one of my favorites too.
I never had it, never even heard of it before. I listened to your show, but it's really good. And
yeah, it is.
Before we spend another hour talking about that, show notes page for this episode of nickflugel.com/182. All of the links that Jacob just talked about will be there to follow him and Tasting Anarchy and Childerberg, and also a few of the articles and podcast episodes we were talking about here. So, also check out libertymugs.com, buy some pint glasses and mugs, and join the Telegram group. I'm trying to remember everything. So, alrighty. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Take it easy.